Craig Larson tells a story that on his desk he liked to display books, kind of photographic sort of books, and those that you see on coffee tables, that sort of thing, and he would display them on a stand. And one time he was displaying this book, America's Spectacular National Parks by Michael Duchemin, and for several days he had the photo open to this picture of the Grand Teton Mountains. It's an extra wide photo, he says, that fills the left page and crosses the fold and goes on to the right page. He describes it, he says it was a majestic display of deep blue sky, rugged gray snow-capped mountains, and a calm lake in the foreground. And one morning, he decided to turn the page to the next photo, and he discovered that he had missed something. You see, the right page of the Grand Tetons photo was an extra long folded over page covering part of the Grand Tetons. And when he opened it up, it added some 16 inches to the photo. And then he says you could really experience the full picture of the Grand Tetons. And today, as we are continuing our study in the book of Genesis, we are kind of folding that page over. We've seen a part of the story. We've experienced it a little bit, but the story becomes even more grand. The story has even more meaning as we delve into it just a little bit deeper. Larry, I'm not sure if that's working this morning. There we go. There's a national park thing. Now, so far, we have been studying this story, and those of you who have not been with us for the past few weeks, you might feel a little lost because you're kind of coming in on the middle part of the story. But we have been studying the book of Genesis, and more recently, we've been in the story of Abraham. Abraham, this man that God called out of his homeland and has promised him, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. And Abraham, in faith, left his homeland and followed God into this distant land. And there was one problem. Abraham's wife couldn't bear children. How's God going to make a nation out of a man whose wife can't bear children? And then when they get to the land where God had promised, I'm going to give you all of this land, it's filled with pagan people, large Canaanite cities. So here is Abraham living in a tent in the middle of this land inhabited by Canaanite people. What's God going to do? Is God going to come through? Is God going to fulfill his promise or not? And this is where we find ourselves in the story this morning. Now, we've got to remember that God promised Abraham great descendants, right? And through this nation that God would create out of Abraham, God would bless the entire world. And ultimately, Jesus would come through this line and the world would be blessed through Jesus. But if we zoom back out and then zoom in on Abraham, right now, all we've got is an old man living in a tent. And so that's where we find ourselves this morning. Now, God had miraculously provided a son for him. We know that story. And then last week, Matt so skillfully talked about the story of God telling him to go and to sacrifice his son. And Abraham, by faith, went and was willing to sacrifice his son. At the last minute, God said, no way, provided a ram. And that was a foreshadowing, really, of what he would do through Jesus. But today, in our story, Abraham is growing old, and his son is wifeless. Now, again, you're going to have a hard time creating a nation out of a man with no wife, don't you think? And so Abraham's worried about how this is all going to work out. Now, open your Bibles with me to Genesis chapter 24. And because we're going to be studying the whole chapter this morning, we're not going to read the whole thing first. We're just going to kind of work through it piece by piece. So let me encourage you to leave your Bibles open. But I'm going to begin in verse 1 of chapter 24. Abraham was now old and well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed him in every way. He said to the chief servant in his household, the one in charge of all that he had, put your hand under my thigh. I want you to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I am living, but will go to my country and my own relatives and get a wife for my son Isaac. Now, again, Abraham's old. The text tells us that God has blessed him in every way. There's no reason to think that God's going to bail on him now. But Abraham is concerned that his son Isaac will marry a wife from the local neighborhood. And the local neighborhood, not too good of a neighborhood. Canaanite women everywhere. And he's worried Isaac's going to meet a nice, pretty young Canaanite woman and marry her, and she's going to throw him off course, and that God's promise will not be fulfilled. So Abraham's worried about this. So Abraham commissions his servant to go to his homeland and to find a wife for Isaac there and to bring her back. Now, the servant isn't too sure that this plan is going to work out. He's thinking, is a woman going to leave her homeland, her family, and come and live with us here in tents among a pagan people? The servant's going, I don't think so. I don't think this is going to work out. And so the servant tells Abraham, I'm just not sure I can fulfill this. And then look at verse 5. The servant says, what if a woman is unwilling to come back with me to this land? Shall I take your son back to the country you came from? So in other words, if I can't get her to come here, should I come back and get Isaac and take him there? Tell me what to do, Abraham. Now, Abraham is very clear in his instructions. Look at verse 6. Make sure that you do not take my son back there. Do you see how Abraham's life is centered on this promise of God? What did God tell him to do? God told him to leave that land, right? God was very clear. This land full of Canaanite peoples, this is the land that I'm going to give you. And Abraham's not willing to bail on God's promise. He's not willing for Isaac to go back there. You see, that would be rewinding. That would be going back where they came from. And Abraham is not willing to do that. Do not take him back, he says. And then he says, promise me, put your hand under my thigh. And that's just kind of awkward, isn't it? But this is what they did. This is the way they made promises. It's kind of like shaking a hand in today's world. But this is the way they made covenants or oaths. And then he says in verse 8, if the woman is unwilling to come back with you, then you will be released from this oath of mine. Only do not take my son back there. Let's follow God in this deal. Let's stay faithful to what God has called us to do. So how is it going to work out? The servant packs his stuff up and he heads out for this land. Look at verse 10. Then the servant took 10 of his master's camels and left. Taking with him all kinds of good things from his master, he set out for Aram Naharaim and made his way to the town of Nahor. Now, in those days, people would walk or ride camels for long distances. It wasn't a quick trip, right? We did Roger, about 1,700 miles this week. You wouldn't do that in the Middle East. You'd make your way, it'd take days for you to get there. There were no audio books, no podcasts, nothing to keep your attention. And this servant is traveling, and the whole time he's traveling, you got to think he's thinking, this isn't going to work out. I don't know how I'm going to convince her to go with me, because I'm going to start talking about where we're living, and then I'm going to tell her we live in tents, and she's probably going to go, no way I'm going with you. I don't know how this is going to work out, but I'm going to go. He's faithful to go. And then we get to verse 11. He arrives there. By the time you get to verse 11, he arrives at the place, and he has his camels kneel down to the well outside the town. It was toward evening, the time when the women would go out to draw water. And so as his camels are kneeling down to drink water, he prays to God. Look what he says in verse 12. Then he prayed, O Lord, God of my master Abraham, give me success today and show kindness to my master Abraham. See, I am standing beside this spring, and the daughters of the townspeople are coming out to draw water. In other words, there's women all over the place. I don't know what to do. I'm not sure how this is going to work out. Not sure how to start the conversation. And so he says in verse 14, may it be that when I say to a girl, please let down your jar that I may have a drink, and she says, drink and I'll water your camels too, let her be the one you have chosen for your servant Isaac. By this I will know that you have shown kindness to my master. In other words, not sure how I'm going to start the conversation. I'm not sure what I'm going to say. And so he kind of asks God for a sign, doesn't he? It kind of says, okay, God, I'll say to her, can I have a drink of water? I can do that. That's not too awkward. That's not too weird. I think I can pull that one off. So he says, I'll have a drink of water. And God, I tell you what, when I get to the right one, she will then say, let me give your camels some water too, and I'll know that's the one that you want. And then I'll ask her to be the woman. He kind of lays out a condition for God, you know. We do this sometimes, don't we? You ever done this? God, if this happens, then that's the right way. God, if this works out this way, then I'll know that it's you, and you'll direct me that way. We do this a lot. But notice the posture of the servant. He's desperate, isn't he? I mean, he's living in this place of desperation. He doesn't know how this is going to work out. He doesn't know if it's going to work out. He doesn't know what to say. And so what does he do? He turns to God and he says, God, I need you to let me know the direction to go here. And it seems that this is where God wants us most of the time. You know, many times we just think, well, I'm just going to go this way. If it works out, then that's fine. But God wants us in this place where we're desperate, where we're going, I don't know. God, I need you to show up and show me which way. This posture of dependence. Look at the language of a text now. We're going to keep reading the story, verse 15. Before he had finished praying, Rebekah came out with her jar on her shoulder. Now, is he praying with his eyes open here? So how does he know that she's there before? He sees her before he even gets the prayer out of his mouth. She was a daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, who was the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor. The girl was very beautiful, a virgin. No man had ever lain with her. She went down to the spring, filled her jar, and came up again. The servant hurried to meet her and said, please, give me a little water from your jar. So she catches his eye. She's very beautiful. I think Isaac would be pleased. Maybe she's the one. So he hurries to meet the girl. Okay, could I have some water to drink? And he holds his breath. What's she going to say? Is she going to say what she needs to say? Look at verse 18. Drink, my Lord, she said, and quickly lowered the jar to her hands and gave him a drink. After she had given him a drink, she said, I'll draw water for your camels too until they have finished drinking. Cha-ching, right? She said it. Exactly what she was supposed to say. Now, look at the language of a text here. The man doesn't even have the prayer out of his mouth, right? And she shows up. It says he hurries to meet her. She quickly lets down the jar. So it's fast-paced here. God's moving quickly, right? And he's just trying to hold on for dear life as God's doing what he's doing. But will God come through? He's still not sure yet. Not positive. And look in the next verse, verse 21. Without saying a word, the man watched her closely to learn whether or not the Lord had made his journey successful. I think this is a key verse in the text here. Because remember the condition that the man laid out? You know, if I say this, she'll say this. That was his condition, wasn't it? It wasn't that God told him that she would say this. He made that condition, right? And so we have to realize that if we're going to kind of like put these, what you might call the fleeces out for God, right? God, if this happens, then you're telling me to do this. We got to be careful when we put those out because we're doing that. God's not doing that. You know, if the sun comes up and it's a cloud and there's a bird flying over, then God, you want me to take that job. You know, it's kind of what we do sometimes. And it seems kind of crazy, but a lot of times we do. Well, when we do that, we got to realize that's us. That's not God. We're making that condition, not God. And so the man is still in this place where he's still watching. He's still discerning. He's still not sure if she's the one. Now, he thinks, maybe so, right? I'm going to go for it. But we're not positive if she is the one yet. And then he makes his move. Look at verse 22. When the camels had finished drinking, the man took out a gold nose ring weighing a beka and 2 gold bracelets weighing 10 shekels. Then he asked, whose daughter are you? Please tell me, is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night. Now, what you need to realize is that in this day and time, there was a culture of hospitality. In other words, if you're a stranger and you're in town, you don't just go down to the local hotel and check in, or go on Priceline or Hotwire and find a room. That's not how it worked then. You would go, and there would be people in the town. It's very much part of the ancient Near Eastern culture that you would provide a meal for a stranger, and provide bedding for a stranger, and you would send them on their way. In fact, if you didn't, your name was at stake. Your reputation was at stake if you didn't do that. So the man is asking for that. But it's more than that, because he's pulling out, what, nose rings and bracelets. Now, we might think it's a little weird that he's pulling out nose rings. I mean, did she have her nose pierced, But he's pulling this out, and we do know from culture and artifacts of this time period that nose rings were very common in this day and time. They found lots of those around. So we know that women like to wear nose rings. They like to wear bracelets. But as he presents these gifts to her, it would have been understood that he was there for more than just a night's stay and a meal. He was proposing to her. He's offering a proposal to her. Now, not his own proposal. She would have known that he's a servant, but she is representing someone else. And so as he offers this jewelry to her, by her accepting this jewelry, she is entertaining this marriage proposal. So that's what's going on here. Verse 26, and this is a key verse in the text. Verse 26, then the man bowed down and worshiped the Lord, saying, praise be to the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not abandoned his kindness and faithfulness to my master. As for me, the Lord has led me on a journey to the house of my master's relatives. So it's more. He's more than just excited about getting a meal and a night's stay, isn't he? He realizes God's coming through here. This just may be the one. If she's accepted the nose rings and the bracelets, she may accept, again, this invitation. Still got another hurdle to cross here. Still not quite there, but he thinks she seems to be willing. And he pauses at this point in time, and he gives God the credit for what's happened so far. You'll see this. He worships in multiple places in this chapter. But this is important, I think. He could have said, I was really slick back there. I really said the right things to pull her in, and she said yes. That the little plan about I'll say this, and if she said that was brilliant, I can't believe I thought of that, He doesn't do that. He says, it was all you, God. You're the one that did this. I haven't done anything. You seem to be giving me success on my journey. And he's confident at this point that God is going to give him success. He's moving, isn't he, from this place of doubt to a place of confidence that God's going to come through here. Now, verse 34 is the good part here. So he said, I am Abraham's servant. The Lord has blessed my master abundantly, and he became wealthy. He's given him sheep and cattle, silver, gold, men servant, maid servants, camels, and donkeys. My master's wife Sarah has borne him a son in her old age, and he has given him everything he owns. So, see what the servant's doing? He's backing up all the way back to Abraham and all of Abraham's story. He's telling it all from the beginning. This is what's happened. God called my master Abraham out of this land. He went to that land. God has blessed him. He was faithful, and God has come through. And his wife, old woman, bearing a child. Can you believe that happened? And he tells the whole story. Time and time again, he's telling the story of God, the story of God's movement over and over again. And then we get to verse 50, and this is, you go back to the house where the girl is from, and the girl's brother and father. Now, in Middle Eastern culture, the girl couldn't just say, all right, let's go, and take off. They had to get permission from the father and the brother. So they go to Laban and Bethuel, and he tells him the story of God's movement, what God's been doing over and over again. And then Laban and Bethuel answered, this is from the Lord. We can say nothing to you one way or the other. Here is Rebekah. Take her and go, and let her become the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has directed. Now look at this here. And think about this for a minute. Stranger showing up comes home with your daughter. She's got on some new jewelry. And he says, this is what God's been doing. We want her to go with us, and we can take her, and she's going to marry this guy. We're going to live in a tent among pagans. Most parents would have said, are you kidding me, right? No, you're not. That's what most parents would have said. But as they hear the story, they are convinced that God's in this deal. And I love this phrase in the story. They simply say, we don't know. We don't know one way or another, but it seems God is in this, and we're going to go. You know, as we make decisions, both individually and collectively, many times we ask the wrong questions, don't we? Many times we ask questions like, do I like this? Or, does this sound good to me? When we should be asking, is God leading me in this direction or that direction? You know, in a few weeks, we're going to vote on Matt and Heather being a part of our church staff. And we're going to do that as a congregation. And too often when we make decisions as a congregation, people are saying, you know, well, do I like this or do I like that? Maybe I want a youth minister or a music minister. But you have to remember, we as a church started a year ago talking about, well, how do we staff as a church? We went through a discernment process. And we didn't ask, what do we want? We asked, God, what do you want? Right? It's a different question. And God seems to have been leading us toward an associate pastor whose focus is worship and outreach. And it's not about, okay, this is what we want. This is, God, how are you leading us? What do you want? And the church affirmed that in October. And then the church commissioned a search team to say, God, what do you want? Not what do we want? We didn't take a survey. Everybody fill out, what they want. Have all the qualifications. We said, God, what do you want? And the search team has come back and they've said, we feel like God is leading us toward Matt. We feel like this is the direction that God is leading us. And too often, we ask, God, what do we want? When we should be saying, God, what do you want? And you can imagine Rebekah's father may have had dreams for his daughter, right? Marrying, somebody locally or a prince or somebody who would give her lots of stuff and they'd live in a big castle somewhere. Or, maybe living down the street so that he could see the grandkids. He probably had different things for his daughter. But when the servant comes and begins to tell the story of God, he says, I'm in. I'm in because God seems to be in this. Maybe it's not what I want, but God seems to be in it. And so they affirm this. Now, we keep reading the story. And we see in verse 52, when Abraham's servant heard what they said, he bowed down to the ground before the Lord. He's like, one more hurdle, right? And they've agreed, and he worships once again. And then we see in verse 54, when they got up the next morning, he said, send me on my way to my master. But her brother and her mother replied, let the girl remain with us 10 days or so, then you may go. Now, a night's sleep changes things sometimes, doesn't it? And they woke up the next morning and they thought, wait a minute. I don't know if I want to just send her off with this stranger. Could she at least stay 10 days? I mean, that seems reasonable, doesn't it? I mean, let's spend a little more time together because you're not necessarily going to be coming home for Christmas, across the desert. But what does the servant say? The servant says, no, we need to go now. God is calling us now. And we need to go now. Isn't that interesting? Sometimes when God calls us, sometimes when we're required to step out in faith, we go, let me just have a little more time to think about this. And God's saying, no, you've got to respond now in faith. And so they do the unthinkable. In Middle Eastern culture, the women didn't have any say-so. Women just kind of went where the men told them to go. But they call Rebekah in, and they ask her what do you think? And look how she responds in verse 58. They called Rebekah and asked her, will you go with this man? And what does she say? I will go. Rebekah has faith that God is in this deal. And so she joins him and she goes. Too often, God is calling us. God has invited us to participate with him. And for whatever reason, we have hesitancy. We don't go. But Rebekah here, she exhibits the faith of Abraham, and she goes. I don't think we can diminish how hard this must have been for her. I think we have to remember that. And I think we have to say, this would have been difficult for her to leave her homeland and to go to this place, but she goes nonetheless. Now, I know this next scene here might seem like a Nicholas Sparks movie because, this is where the cheesy music comes in, and this is how this works out. Look what happens here in verse 62. Now, Isaac had come from Beer Lahai Roi. He was living in the Negev, and he went out to the field one evening to meditate, and as he looked up, he saw the camels approaching. Again, cheesy music. The girl is coming, slow motion, right? Rebekah also looked up and saw Isaac. She got down from her camel and asked the servant, who is that man in the field coming to meet us? He is my master, the servant answered. So she took her veil and covered herself. We can picture the glances across the field, right? Their eyes meeting, sparkling as they see each other. We have been told in the text that Rebekah is very beautiful. We don't know what Isaac looks like, but maybe he's a pretty attractive guy too. I'm not sure. Is he the one, she asks. Yes, he's the one. So she does what would be appropriate in Middle Eastern culture. She pulls the veil over her face and she goes to meet him. And I find it interesting what we read in verse 66 here. It says, then the servant told Isaac all he had done. Do you see the theme here? The servant is telling the story the whole time. The whole time. You wouldn't believe it. I did this, I prayed this, and she did this, and she said this, and I gave her the gold ring, and then I went to her dad, and then they said, stay in 10 days. The whole story, you can just see Isaac just going, that's all right, I'll just spend some time with her right now. But he tells her the whole story. And I think the story is important because it solidifies what God is doing. You know that? You ever had that experience where you need to tell the story again because the faith that's going to be required in the days to come, you're going to need that story to cement that faith. She's about to move into a tent, and she's about to live among pagan people with a promise that God is going to make a great nation out of her. And I'll let you in on a secret here. She's barren. She doesn't know that yet because she's not married yet. But she's not going to have a kid for 20 years. She's going to need this story to cement her commitment to what she's doing. And we'll talk more about that next week. Look at verse 67, and this is how the story closes. Isaac brought her into the tent of his mother Sarah, and he married Rebekah. So she became his wife, and he loved her. And Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So what do we do with this? What does this story mean for us? In a few minutes, you're going to hear a story from one of us, one of you, if you will. This morning, Troy Hirschman came up here, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about this because Troy's not here in this service. But Troy and Cindy couldn't have children, and they were torn up by that. And Troy told the story this morning of his walk, of his stepping out in faith in some places where God moved, and they weren't sure how it was going to happen. And they adopted little Carolyn. If you remember, her birth mother was in jail and was on drugs, and they had to go through about 6 weeks in the NIC unit with her. They had another adoption that fell through, and then they got Sam. And he told that story this morning. And he said, every time I have another place in my life where I need faith, I remember how God provided over here. You see? And I think that's what we learned from the story this morning. Every time we need to step out in faith, we remember when God provided in faith there. And so this promise for Abraham, it's central to his life. He left his land, right? And went in faith. God provided. So, well, we're not going to get a girl from over there. Let's just find a girl. Let's just take Isaac back. No, we're not going to do that. God's going to provide. They go, and God provides again. Again and again we see this. As the people of God respond in faith, God provides for them. I'm not sure what God would be saying to you this morning. I'm not sure if He's calling you to step into some unknown place. But this morning, we are part of this story, aren't we? Abraham is our father. Isaac is our father. Rebekah is our mother, spiritually. And their story is our story. How they respond in faith and God provides, we too are called often to respond in the same sort of way. Let's stand together now as we sing, and you are now given an opportunity to respond. You can come and pray here if you need to do that. I'll be standing down front if there's a decision that you would like to make.
Whole story, you know what's happened since we've been here. It goes way far back. I think we might get some feedback. Probably 2000 is when it started. But we made some pretty big mistakes as young adults that you may not know about. We both have been previously married and divorced, but that's what makes us so great and why we love each other so much. So I'll let Casey start.
Well, to start it all off, I was raised in a Southern Baptist church, and growing up, I was always told you don't want to find somebody who doesn't share your same beliefs, and basically you don't want to be with someone who is, as the church would call it, unequally yoked. Well, I turned 18 and I married a Mormon, which went completely against what obviously God's will would have been for me. Turned 18, went to the military, and there was a time in which, now hindsight's 2020, I can look back and see that that's where God started my journey to where I am now. And I'd been in the military for about 2 years. At that time, Katie was in middle school. And a really close friend of mine who's now like a brother to me came to my squadron and became a co-worker of mine. He'd been there for about 4 days, and he locked himself out of his dorm room and was not able to find a place to sleep that night. He didn't know me from anybody. He just had my phone number, and he called me. And he came to my house that night, and he stayed the night until the next day when he could go get a new key for his dorm room. We became very close friends, and to this day, he's like a brother to me.
Meanwhile, in middle school, that's when I really started thinking about relationships. The only thing I wanted in my life was to grow up and be a mom and a wife. So that's when I really made the list of what I wanted in a mate and started praying over that. And then also started praying, I know it's funny, but I started praying for the safety of my future husband. I prayed for that he would be guided by God, that God would have his hand on him. And later on, I thought that's who I married at first, but now that I know, it wasn't. So, anyway.
After a while, she and I grew apart, and I can tell you honestly, one of the main things we would argue about was our beliefs. And it became apparent to me as it went on why it was that I was taught my entire life that I shouldn't, marry someone or be with someone who doesn't believe the same way that I do. We grew apart. I was on a deployment to the Middle East, and I actually was able to come home about 4 days early than where I was supposed to. thought I was going to come home and surprise her, and apparently I did. I basically came home to something that, I probably will never forget. It was a terrible situation. I won't get into details on that. But to make a long story short, we ended up divorcing because of it, and that really solidified my decision to get out of the military. I was out in California. I'm from Nashville, Tennessee, and I was away from family. I was going through this tough time, and I decided it was about the time when I needed to get out, and I decided rather than re-enlisting that I should get out and go back home and be close to family, which was a very good thing, because I was able to go back to the church that I grew up in and start my journey in the right direction with God at that point.
And then during that time, I went to college for a semester. I dropped out after a semester because I was not in good situations. So I decided to go back home and live with my mom and dad and my family. So I was able to do things with my free time. I went out to Kansas for a wedding, and that's where I met my ex-husband at that time. And I lived in Kansas for about 1.5 years, and he traveled a lot for work, so I was always alone. I had nobody. I had no family there or anything, so I convinced him to let us move back to the area where my family was, and we were living in Greentown, Indiana, and renting a house there. And he got a break during the winter, so he didn't have to work during the winter, and about Christmas time was when I finally knew in my heart that this was the wrong thing. I mean, I pretty much knew the whole time, but I was too stubborn to listen. And found out some information during Christmas of his unfaithfulness, and I decided in January of 2010 that I would divorce him and not have any part in that relationship ever again.
And this is kind of where it starts where God's plan, even though we made terrible decisions and strayed down the wrong path that God expected us to go down, He still was trying to pull us in the right direction. And in January of 2010, at the same time that this stuff was going on with Katie, the company that I worked for at the time in Nashville, Tennessee, went bankrupt, and I no longer had a job. At the time, I was in a long-distance relationship with a girl I was dating for about 4 or 5 months. She lived in California, back actually where I was stationed when I was in the military. When the company went bankrupt in January of 2010, I decided that I would get all my stuff. I had a lot of money saved up in the bank, and I was single, and decided, you know what, I don't have a job. I don't really have to stay here. I'll go out there and see if we can, make this relationship work. I was there for 3 days and realized that was a bad decision. So at that point, I decided that, I'm already out here, and I'm a long way from Nashville. Let me just kind of travel around the country with, the money that I've got saved up in the bank, and visit friends and family that I haven't seen in a very long time. So for about 2 months, I actually did that. I traveled all over the United States, visiting people. And at the beginning of February, or actually at the beginning of March, I was heading back to Nashville, was planning on setting back down there, finding a new job, and I got a phone call from my friend Rich, who I spoke about earlier, that I met in the military, who I'm very close with, and he was going through a tough time in his life. And I told him I had been, what was going on with me. I hadn't talked to him in 3 or 4 months. And I told him where I'd been, what I'd been doing. He goes, well, why the heck didn't you come and see me? I'm right up here in Indiana. You went everywhere, didn't come see me. I said, you know what, I'm sorry about that. I'll come up there and see you. I still have some time, and I got a little bit of money still saved up. So I drove to Marion, and spent about a month and a half with him, just, helping him through his tough time, and started to run out of money. So, I started praying to God, asking him, what his plan was for me. Should I stay in Indiana? Should I look for a job? Or should I go back down to Nashville and, start doing that? Rich told me that he still needed me around, so I said, look, I got to get a job at this point. So I was looking around Marion, and as you all know, Marion doesn't really have the biggest job pool in Indiana. So I actually decided to try to go out to Kokomo. There's a little town right between Marion and Kokomo called Greentown. And on the way to Kokomo, there was a sign on the side of the road and in a little bar that said "Help Wanted." So I said, "Oh, I'll stop in there just for the heck of it and see if they want to hire me." I walked in, filled out an application. They hired me on the spot. I mean, it was like a 2-question interview. They hired me on the spot, and I was like, "Okay, that's a little weird." I started the next day.
And at the time, I was working by about 60 hours a week. I was a manager for a coffee shop. I was working a lot, long hours, and still living in Greentown, renting by myself. On my way home one day, a break between my work, I passed the bar, saw a very handsome young gentleman changing the "Help Wanted" sign. But I had a really rough day that day, and I was just really overwhelmed. I went home, and something really minuscule happened at home, and I just broke down. All the stress that had been going on with me and the divorce and all the hours I had been working, it was just horrible. I just broke down, and I fell on the floor, and I said, "God, I cannot do this anymore. I cannot be alone. I need you to guide me. I need to know what to do. I'm just broken. Please unbreak me." And the next day I had another long day at work, which was typical, and I was starving. I needed to eat, and I didn't want to cook for myself. So about 9 o'clock that night, I went into the bar, and they have the best tenderloins ever. So I went in to get a tenderloin, and he was working. And the door flung open, and an angel sang, no, I'm just... So I ended up that night, we talked pretty much the whole time. He was distracted I'm surprised he didn't get fired. And at the end of the night, I just felt something say, just give him your number, because he's not going to ask. And I wasn't one to just, hey, here's my number, So I handed him my number, and ended up leaving the bar around 3 a.m., which is when last call is.
She had to be at work at 5.
Had to be at work at 5. During my 2-hour nap, he had texted me, and I didn't get a chance to respond because I was sleeping, and then when I woke up, I saw it and responded. He didn't talk to me for 4 days, so
I thought I had made a mistake by texting her immediately after she gave me the number, so I kind of let it slide for a little while, and I called her.
I was like, oh great, well that's okay, no big deal, but we ended up being together every single day, and we got married in November and had Micah a year and a half later, and so
and what was really cool about the situation is when we actually sat down and talked about all this. I know it sounds funny that God started this plan in motion, back when she was in middle school and I was in the military, which I know sounds weird, but if you really look at it, I mean the fact that Rich had one option, and that was to call me to come and have somewhere to sleep, and God put him in my life. To 10 years later need me to come up and be with him during a time of need, and ended up being here, and meeting Katie and having this, through all the times that I've made bad decisions and Katie's made bad decisions, God was still trying to guide us in the right direction, and it's just a really awesome thing to look back and see. So
really long story. We met in a bar. Thanks, guys. That was really long, but...
Thank you guys for sharing your story. And Wade's early in the early service that God's story is our story. God is acting in Abraham and Sarah's life, and in Isaac and Rebekah, and he's acting in Katie Casey's life, and he's acting in all of our lives. God is the one that's writing history. We may think that we're doing it, but God's at work here. And so as we're going to stand together and be invited to give, we're going to worship God through